questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Katie. This has been excellent. I am going to end it on this last slide so people can see your face when they ask you a question. So if you do have a question, please do type it into the question box. I do have a question. What about transportation costs? If somebody were very interested, say, in doing a clinical trial that was in the city and they live in the suburbs, is there some element built into a clinical trial that will help them get down there if they don't have transportation? Because that's often, I think, a barrier for a lot of people, is not being able to get to a clinical trial.
Yes, almost always. There's only been a handful of times I've seen where reimbursement is not an option. Again, this is when it's really important to look at that informed consent. It will talk about different payments. So typically it's on mileage. So if you, I know probably the most standard is if you're over 50 miles from that institution, we will pay mileage. And that's typically about a 50-cent mileage. We also reimburse things for lunch if you have to travel, for example, 3 hours. So I'm in the middle of the Midwest, so 3 hours isn't that far, but you can travel long distances. So if we're driving 3 hours, we can reimburse for food and that gas to and from. Another really good option is lodging. We have different things called, in Kansas City, it's the Hope Lodge. If you have a cancer diagnosis, it is free. They have a community kitchen. You can bring your own food. And there's usually a twin bed or two in different rooms. And so you can stay there when you need to get your treatment. So if it's a long drive and your treatment's at 8 a.m., you can actually have that approved to stay there so that you don't have to leave the house at 4 o'clock in the morning to get to your treatment. So there's many different options. It's always great to, again, ask. Oftentimes we're giving you so much information, you've been diagnosed, you've had all this imaging, by the time you see the doctor and the research team, you're probably worn out at that visit. So oftentimes we're giving a lot of information. So sometimes that's probably one of the biggest things I see is not really discussed. So that's, again, when it's really important for us to ask those questions. And so usually if you ask, it's usually never a no, but every once in a while on those really low funded trials, they might say no. But usually we have other grants within our institution that can help pay for those additional costs as well.
Mm-hmm. So I know you're there at the University of Kansas Medical Center. Do you think most other big teaching hospitals have similar programs in place for their patients that might be interested in a clinical trial?
Yes. So typically the reimbursement is by the pharmaceutical company. So if that clinical trial is opened at every state in the United States, we'll say they're at all 50 states, and all the patients participating in that specific clinical trial, no matter where you're located in the country, will have that mileage reimbursement. The lodging would be a little bit different. I think that there are so many different advocacy groups and non-for-profits that support our cancer patients that there are so many options out there that are just hidden. So always ask if there's any kind of financial burden. There's so many things we can do to help. A few examples even that I've worked on are we can work with the pharma companies to get a drug at a reduced cost. Sometimes what people often overlook is that if you actually buy your medications at an institution or a large hospital, we get bulk pricing. So typically drugs are a bit cheaper purchased within the institution. Another area is we have most patients see a financial counselor to really just go over kind of what is this going to cost me? Because a lot of times people think cancer is so expensive. And it really can be sometimes depending on your insurance coverage or what kind of treatments you're receiving. And so we always have our financial counselors really go over information of just what to expect so that we don't have that extra anxiety driven, what kind of bill am I going to get? And then the other option too is we have what's called an endowment office. So that's really all our donations and different things that people contribute to help our patients and our institution. And so I've even helped patients apply for those grants to help pay for their medication. And the other thing we can even do is we can actually, if for instance, you can't pay your rent because you're paying your medical bills, we actually have grants and other things to actually help cover things like mortgage and car payments and food cost, because your insurance and all your extra money is going to pay for that cancer care. So there's so many different angles where that financial burden can really be put at ease. You just really have to probably be the one driving that conversation. So like most of the time we're seeing so many patients in a day, sometimes that's not what we're focused on is the financials. And so it's always a big topic. We try to do our best to discuss it with patients at every visit. But this is really great for patients and their families and caregivers to really ask these questions at these visits.
Okay. It seems as though there's a scarcity of trials in some locations, and in others there are a lot more of them. I do want to just mention that if people go to the Beacon website, bcan.org, and at the very top it'll say clinical trials, there is a way where you can search for clinical trials. It's the same trials that come from clinicaltrials.gov, but they're laid out a little bit differently, and you can save them and email them to your family members or to your doctor and ask your doctor specifically about whether this is a good trial for you. But why is it that there seem to be pockets of places where there's a lot of trials, and then in some geographic areas, even where there are large teaching hospitals, there may not be a whole lot of trials? Do you have any idea, Katie?
Yes, there's many angles to that play a factor. One huge aspect is infrastructure. At KU, we have about a team of 500 researchers to do all these clinical trials. So when we see different institutions, especially private, it's a financial issue to staff this many people to be able to bring all these trials on. Oftentimes, such as the KU Cancer Center, we never make money off clinical trials. So you have to find other financial support to really make sure that you can cover those costs, because you're basically just always eating that cost. Another aspect is the institutional support. Do you have the right teams in place? We have an IRB. So you have what's called a local and a central IRB. These are those review committees for patient safety. KU has its own review board. We have our own radiation safety review board. We have our protocol review committee. And so if you actually have to outsource this, it's very expensive. Another aspect is very expensive to clinical trials to be able to maintain our databases and space. Where can people that are conducting clinical trials see patients? So KU has a whole facility where we have designed it specifically to be 100% research patients and those visits. And so when you're trying to squeeze into a patient's visit with their doctor and ask them all these questions, it can bog down our standard of care clinics, and then that causes patients to wait longer. And so there's multiple different angles here that are important to know, that infrastructure, those teams, and those different level of expertise. Kind of the counter opposite side is you have to go through what's called a site selection. So there's two phases of being selected for a clinical trial. So for example, I really want this new drug and we want to bring it to KU. So I actually have to have a conference where I bring that pharmaceutical company on site, and they literally walk around the building with me and look at our laboratory. And that's to make sure that I'm not just telling them, hey, I have a lab, I can draw blood. They want to physically see it to make sure. They look at my CT imaging scan machines. They'll look at where our blood is processed. They will look at what rooms we see patients in. Where do we store our supplies? Where's the paper stored? And if for some reason you don't meet all those requirements in order to conduct that study, you will actually not be allowed to have that drug at your site. So there's different aspects that are required for us to have in order to bring that trial to our institution. And so this is where KU is a bench to bedside facility, and not every institution is. KU only became a full bench to bedside model probably about 10 years ago. So we got a phase 1 facility, and that was the big piece of kind of branching to that NCI designated cancer center. And so what that means is we're allowed to monitor patients overnight and to see really how those drugs metabolize through their blood. And so kind of all these different aspects are so financially draining for institutions. Sometimes they're just not interested in having research. My department is very huge on research, so it's a big priority for us, but another department might not be as interested in it. And so it's kind of part of it is you seeking out those clinical trials, and you're also being selected to conduct them. One aspect they look at that's very important is they actually get all of our resumes, including our physicians. Even the chair of my department, Dr. Holzberlein, will send in his resume, and it'll show what types of trials they've done, what kind of publications, what's their experience, what do they see as routine clinical care, do they even have this patient population? You know, are they an expert or are they brand new in the field? So all of these different things have different requirements in order for us to even onboard a clinical trial. I would say for a phase 1 to a phase 3 clinical trial, it could take anywhere from the point of idea conception for us to actually open, anywhere from 3 months to a year. So once we hear about the trial, we probably won't see it till the following year to actually be open in our clinic for us to give that drug to patients. And so it's a very daunting process, and it's very timely and a lot of paperwork. And so again, this I just hope makes people feel more comfortable that in order for us to even open a clinical trial, it had to go through so many channels and safety boards to just even be opened. And so we get very excited when we get to that accomplishment and get that trial open to be able to give our patients that extra treatment.
Excellent. So let me ask another question. If an investigational drug is producing a benefit for a patient, would they be able to continue to get the drug when the trial ends?
Most of the time, yes. We call that kind of compassionate care use. So let's say there's 10 people in this trial and it worked really well for 2 of them, but maybe it's not going to even make it to the next phase of that clinical trial. Those 2 people can still go through the channels to get that drug because it's working for them through that compassionate care use protocol, and that takes a lot of work from your physician and you to fill all that information out to get those approvals. At that point, it becomes kind of a different avenue because it's not on the market. So getting insurance coverage to continue that drug off label is a different piece. And then also the cost, because we don't know what it should cost because it's not on the market yet. But at some point, I don't know if that pharmaceutical company would gift it to them for free since they're not going to be able to move forward with it, or if they would make someone pay for it. The other kind of aspect you can do is, let's say there's treatments such as the chemotherapies. They might only be 4 cycles per routine care. If it's really working for you and maybe you're not a surgical candidate, you can keep getting those, what's called off-label, meaning as long as the doctor feels comfortable treating you with those systemic chemos or even immunotherapies, they can keep giving you additional treatments as long as it's benefiting you. So if at any point those little lesions in there grow at all, that treatment really is deemed no longer working. And so they won't want to continue that treatment should it not be beneficial for you anymore.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. And this is all about the results of a trial. Do patients ever get any feedback on what happened as a result of their participation or the overall results of a drug?
Yes, you should all receive that information. I actually sent these out the other day. So when the trial is done, the hard part is a lot of the treatment trials are really long trials. So we might do long-term follow-up for 15 years. So it might take us 15 years before you get a letter in the mail. If you move between that time and we lose your address, sometimes it's really hard to get that information to you. But typically when we finish the results, we type up the letter and we include the publication link inside, or provide the publication itself in there to let you know what happened. Usually by the time your treatment's done, we know if it worked well or not for you, even if we don't know whether it was that placebo or the standard of care or the standard of care plus another drug. And so when we look at that data, we really show, you'll hear 3 phases, that it was superior drug, equivalent, or less than equivalent. And so really, no matter what happens, we want to share those results. So a lot of times people might ask, do you not publish bad results? We will publish all results, good or bad, because it's beneficial to the next person that might look at something very similar. And so that data should always be compiled and sent out in a letter to all patients who participated. I would say that's one thing that's often missed just because of the duration of these trials. Sometimes we just can't get it out to people. But if you even just throw the clinical trial information into Google, it usually will pull up any results that we have as well.
Thank you so much. This has been incredibly helpful. I appreciate all of the information that you shared. I'd like to once again thank the Estella Seattle Genetics Partnership, Bristol Myers Squibb, the EMD Serono Pfizer Partnership, Fairgene, Genentech, Janssen Oncology, Merck, and PhotoCure for their support of the Patient Insight webinar series.